Excellent. Okay, so archaeopolitics. I would like today to offer an introduction to this idea of archaeopolitics. That is the strategy of enforcing political beliefs through ideological templates incorporating archaeological practice. My examples today will come both from my homeland, which is Greece, but also my native Egypt, as a reminder of the personal investment tying us all with the past as a discourse as well as an embodied experience in the present. What I'm planning to do is hold this class in two parts. The first one being archaeo-bodies. I think. Which one? It doesn't work. No. Sorry, it did work just 1 minute ago. Okay, properly? Yeah, okay. So, part one, archaeo-bodies. Let me take you to a place in Greece, which I really love, the village of Kardamili, a village of about 300 permanent inhabitants situated in the heart of the Mani Peninsula in the South Peloponnese, approximately 35 kilometers southeast of Kalamata. Its traditional architecture, mostly preserved or restored in combination with its scenic beaches and breathtaking mountain views, has made it a focal center for nowadays tourism, as well as a most frequented spot for travelers since the 19th century. As recently as 2013, Kardamili served as the main movie set for Richard Linklater's romantic drama Before Midnight, the third in a trilogy following the recurrent love affair of Jesse, an American man, with Celine, a French woman who met in a train to Vienna sometime in the 1990s. In the movie, the third one, the charming Greek town plays scenery to a melancholic moment of midlife crisis, underlining the sad fact that as Celine is heard complaining just before the finale, fantasies will never match the imperfect reality. One of those fantasies, it would seem, and one of the film's silent protagonists, is a house built by British scholar, soldier, and travel writer Patrick Leigh Fermor, surrounded by an olive grove overlooking the beach of Kalamitsi just outside Kardamili. Fermor was one of the intellectual figures of the 20th century that made the Mani Peninsula what it is now, the destination par excellence of the European or American intellectual seeking to relocate his, very rarely hair, these people tend to be men usually, relocate his soul in the rough terrain of a mountainous region in the periphery of the West. Now, Kardamili is also my top of the list vacation destination for more than 15 years now. And although I do not count myself among the Western intellectuals of the previous paragraph, I do sympathize with those troubled souls, breeze-kissed and sunburnt, trying to make their fantasies match the imperfect reality, while perched on one of those angry rocks at Kalamitsi. At the same time, I cannot help but notice the ways Kardamili's local population try to preserve their own fantasies in a globalized culture of imperfect realities, conditioned to systematically overlook the fantasies of others. In those rare moments I'm not spending on the beach, I find myself getting acquainted with a separate sort of quest. If I am looking for ways to spend time in an effort to kill that sweet summer melancholia we all seem to be suffering when on vacation, I'm aware of Kardamili's systematic efforts to preserve time, to revive, in effect, times past in order to monumentalize them, so as to serve its own narrative of local exception. Take, for example, the town's fallen warriors memorial, now somehow pushed aside in an awkward corner serving as a parking lot of sorts on a crossroads connecting the site of Old Kardamili to the beach. Erected in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars, that is in the mid-1910s, the marble monument is designed as a classical tombstone of sorts, not quite accurate archaeologically, but thoroughly convincing as a prop in the local historicized scenery. The monument is ostensibly celebrating 1821, that is the War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire, and 1912-1913, already then known as the Balkan Wars, the end of which saw Greece doubling its territory by extracting new lands from what till then had been the Ottoman Empire. It is sponsored by Constantine, King of Greece, oddly referred to as the 12th of his name. Actually, he was only the first Constantine to rule Greece after its establishment as a modern nation state in the 1830s, and he was a Dane. He was customarily, though, referred to as number 12, supposedly as the legitimate successor to the Byzantine emperor Constantine Palaiologos 460-odd years earlier, who was the 11th Constantine to rule the Eastern Roman Empire, which the Greeks prefer to dub Byzantium. The classicizing memorial stands as a shrine to the nation's fallen warriors, as well as a reminder of the nation's glorious past, symbolized through the imitation of a classical form that takes us back a couple of millennia and links this beautiful town lying under the shadow of Mountain Taygetus directly to the Parthenon 500 kilometers to the north. The monument thus creates an imagined time-space vortex, whereby the nation is presented, embodied as a coherent entity, as a true ontology, as it were, classical as well as timeless, and in effect, hyper-historical. Besides the monument's pseudo-classical form, this is further emphasized by the actual battlegrounds quoted on its sides, those places where Kardamiliots sacrificed their lives for their homeland, the top 5 being Troy, Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, followed by names of battles where people from the area one assumes did actually fall: Kalamata, Tripolis and Valtezi in 1821, Sarantaporo and Yanitsa in 1912, Ioannina in 1913, and so on. The 5 ancient references managed to create an unbroken continuum between the glories of the past and the epopees of the present day. Troy, to be exact, takes us back to the depths of Hellenic prehistory, itself imagined and monumentalized by the ancient Greeks themselves. It is mentioned here in direct reference to Book 9 of the Iliad, where Kardamili is cited as one of the 7 cities offered by Agamemnon to Achilles as his consolation prize for the loss of his favorite slave girl, whom Agamemnon chose to keep for himself. Shameful as the situation may be, passed on from the one landlord to the next in a pile of gifts meant to restore the pride of the boy prince throwing a tantrum, Homer's reference to modern Kardamili's namesake cannot pass unnoticed. It is systematically and strategically evoked in order to emphasize the place's antiquity as well as the classical, indeed heroic, pedigree of its inhabitants. Contrary to many other sites of memory across Greece, the Kardamili monument does not deal with the nation's political history. Rather, it forms part of a bizarre collection of already outdated copies of European elsewheres in order to monumentalize historical time in the present. Monumental time, British anthropologist Michael Herzfeld was arguing back in 1991, with reference to a similar Greek town on the island of Crete, is separate from social time, that is, distinct from the time we consume and get consumed by in our day-to-day experience. According to Herzfeld, monumental time is reductive and generic and tends to shape events as realizations of some supreme destiny, at the same time condensing social experience to collective predictability. Manically focusing on the past, a past constituted by categories and stereotypes, monumental time serves as the nation state's time frame. Crucially, Hertzfeld also adds, using Benedict Anderson's remark, that it is the magic of nationalism to turn chance into destiny. This kind of fatalism is used to enforce authoritarian control. In my recent work, I use this kind of fatalism, effected through the monumentalization of historical time, a fatalism I would define as both archaeolatric and archaeopathic, and so in effect archaeopolitical, in order to describe my notion of archaeomentality. As I term, the governmental logic of prioritizing antiquity over the present, and thus assuming that the love of things ancient is inherent in modern national populations, thus forming a sort of historical destiny for a nation state such as Greece, Cyprus, Italy, or Turkey. Archaeomentality operates as a notional as well as physical platform through which to manage certain sectors within the population, or even the population as a whole. In other words, archaeomentality is centrally deployed as a biopolitical mechanism in that it renders biopolitics more readily diffusible through the national body politic. Through the archaeopolitical agency of a monument such as that discussed here, modern Greeks are managed into monumentalizing themselves as classical bodies when it comes to war deeds. In the monument, the fallen soldiers of Greek modernity, 1821 to the present, are imagined as epic heroes of times gone by. Greece is thus imagined as a timeless land of heroes sung by poets, as a classical landscape complete with its own ruins and immortal inhabitants. Today, the Kardamili monument, a classicizing homage to a past that never was, stands across the street from a later construct, a grove dedicated to the town's fallen offspring, you see it here, recent, ancient, or even mythical, a campus martius of sorts, calling the nation to arms if need be, and certainly reminding the passerby, friend or foe, of its heroic and thoroughly immortalized ancestry. Archaeomentality is, of course, a regime conditioned by what one could identify as a particular breed of biopolitics. By biopolitics, we mean the politics of a life. And this breed I would call archaeopolitics. This is a public discourse that is both political and archaeological, in that it feeds off a collective desire for the materialities of the past in order to usher a new sort of political technologies into the present. Archaeopolitics is an acculturated form of biopolitics, assimilated into discourses of the past rather than the present or the future. In archaeopolitics, I argue, control over life is disguised as a noble kind of love of things ancient, what one would call an archaeophilia, an aspiration to a higher life model that is not imposed to anyone, but ought to be inherently felt by everyone. As a result, whereas biopolitics strives to organize entire populations according to a newly set disciplinary and regulatory economy, archaeopolitics mobilizes archaeophile sentiments in order to manage life in the present. And as the examples I will be discussing today show, archaeopolitics is effective because it is at the same time corporeal and performative. Archaeomentality is enforced through the construction of archaeo-bodies, destined to inhabit those distinct spaces we have come to admire and desire as the utopian specialities generated by the nation's own history. Such bodies are not just the bodies of the long-gone ancestors, like the mythological heroes who fought and died at Troy, so that present-day Kardamili has something to connect it with Homeric lore. Besides corporeal, cultural identity is also embodied. It constitutes a performative trope, turning a present living body into an archaeo-body, through which historical meanings are produced, legitimized, and recycled. In a strange turn of events, archaeo-bodies serve as the ultimate proof that historical discourse is needed in the first place, and that it may serve as a biotemplate for the life we're asked to live. In order to substantiate my claim, I would like to use a rare photograph from the early 20th century showing a rather particular kind of parade. Luckily, the photo is labeled Greece in New York 4th July Parade. We can therefore be certain of what it is meant to show, what the occasion of the parade is, and where it takes place. From the clothing of the attending crowd and other small clues in the picture, we may safely conclude that it dates from the 1910s or the 1920s. Greece, in the photo's title, refers to a small troop of 7 or most likely 8 people marching in front of the officials' reviewing stand during an Independence Day parade in New York. First comes a 9 or 10-year-old boy dressed in the Greek national, the F-zone costume, holding a sizable picket sign with the country's name in English and in capital letters, Greece. The F-zone uniform, ostensibly going back to the days prior to the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire, was at the time the picture was taken, already established as Greece's national costume through a series of royal decrees starting in the 1860s. Although it does incorporate elements of dress, such as the fez cap or the white, heavily pleated longish kilt, the fustanella, also worn by other Balkan ethnicities, the F-zone uniform has become typical of Greece and its people in more recent years, especially since the tourist glorification of Greece in the 1950s and the 1960s. Seeing an F-zone clad boy or man leading a Greek celebratory parade is by no means uncommon. It is rather familiar spectacle for Olympic opening ceremonies and the like, even in our present day. What seems more far-reached is, in the photo in question, is of course the dress of the other people in the Greek ensemble. Dressed in quasi-antique chitons, imatia, and peploi, 3 women, 2 men, and a boy, and perhaps a 3rd man in the back left corner of the formation, are seen marching in celebration of the birth of a young nation while posing as ambassadors of a very old one. It is crucial to note, and thankfully the picture's label leaves no doubt of that this is a parade celebrating the US and not Greece, and that these people march as Americans, not as Greeks. As representatives of New York's Greek minority, the men and the women of the 4th of July parade have come dressed as ancient Greeks in order to show to their fellow Americans that they, as ethnic Greeks, have brought to their new homeland. This is a clear case of crypto-colonialism, as discussed by Michael Hertzfeld, and I will have the chance to explain further on. So New York's Greek minority chooses to celebrate their new homeland's National Day while reminding their fellow Americans of a heritage that is very familiar to them, classical Greece and its significance for the global West. I now turn to the notion of bodies committed to archaeopolitical regimes and the ways it affects our notions of the past, while at the same time generates new ways through which to politicize the present. One aspect of this interaction that will concern me most is that of appropriation, a colonization of past presences, if you will, that seems to be inherent in such projects. My main case study for this section will come from Egypt, a land globally admired for its archaeological heritage, also defined as global rather than local, as is the case with Greece and Rome, and finally, one where a modern state constructed its own world image based on what others thought of its past. So let me take you a bit far back in time. On the 22nd of May, 1978, American late-night live television variety show Saturday Night Live aired a musical sketch called King Tut. Devised as a piece of funky musical parody, the sketch was performed by comedian Steve Martin, accompanied by a soul band and two female dancers, all dressed in carnivalesque pharaonic costumes. The sketch addressed the treasures of Tutankhamun exhibition touring the US at the time. First shown in London and the British Museum in 1972, after long negotiations between the British authorities and the Egyptian government, the exhibition had been taken to what at the time was the Soviet Union, with whom Egypt seemed to be more aligned politically. Thoughts of the exhibition being brought to the United States as well had been dampened by current political events, notably the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. However, an agreement was eventually reached in 1976, and only after President Nixon and his Egyptian counterpart, Anwar Sadat, had agreed that the American tour would include more exhibits than those taken to the USSR, and at least one more venue, and that was going to be San Francisco. Eventually, the exhibition was a phenomenal success. 8 million people visited the show during its 3-year stay at the Metropolitan Museum in New York alone, defining what later was to be termed a blockbuster show. Steve Martin's sketch, therefore, was performed as a response to the King Tut hype, while the exhibition was still housed at the Metropolitan Museum. Let's have a taste of that. So, King Tut gave his life for tourism. The sketch betrays several of the elements we have so far associated with archaeopolitics. Corporeal involvement, on the one hand, a reenactment of a mostly imagined past, of ways and fashions associated with a glorified version of a past culture. And on the other, a strong sense of parody, combined with a political agenda in the present. Furthermore, a sense that the archaeological is always political, and all for the wrong reasons. However, the sketch itself, packaged as socio-political critique, disguised as idle Saturday night innocent fun in front of the TV in 1970s America, comes across, at least to those of us watching it more than a generation later, as archaeopolitical in itself. Mildly sexist and racist, playfully orientalist and colonialist, it manages to exoticize Egypt and the Egyptians without even mentioning them. For all its progressive packaging, Steve Martin's King Tut, like the treasures of Tutankhamun exhibition in the first place, confirm a centuries-old Western project through which to annex contemporary Egypt and its modern inhabitants, using the country's archaeology as its most formidable weapon. In many ways, Steve Martin's sketch adopts a straightforwardly colonialist narrative for Egyptian antiquity and its material remains, assuming, as a Western tradition going back to the Enlightenment always did, that ancient Egypt and its treasures are solely part of a predominantly white intellectual genealogy. As Timothy Mitchell has shown very convincingly, and this is not Che Guevara, is Flinders Petrie himself, the discipline of Egyptology, that is the study of the archaeology, philology, and history of pre-Roman Egypt, in other words, a study of Egypt before the Arabs, was systematically deployed as an administrative institution, among others, from medicine to town planning, in order to manage Egypt's wealth, resources, and population, in very much the way Foucault and others have described as modern biopolitics. Masked as expertise, an index of modernity in itself, cultural appropriation and acquisition is generated as an archaeopolitical mechanism for population control, as much as in pre-Arab Egypt or post-Ottoman Greece, as well as post-colonial Thailand, India, or Mexico. Countries such as these, as well as their populations, were methodically manufactured along the lines of the technopolitics of artifaction, as outlined by Elliot Collar. In this chain of events, a tourism-based heritage industry was promoted both as a weapon by means of which to colonize the natives and as a way of the latter to achieve their emancipation. Whereas Martin's King Tut undermines this kind of heritage viewed as a tourist pastime and its consumerist agenda that ends up trivializing the very culture it ostensibly wants to celebrate, the deafening silence in the sketch of the modern Egyptians themselves suggests that even for a progressive audience in late 1970s America, the archaeology of Egypt was the privileged field of Western specialists, with contemporary Egyptians acting as mere submissive bystanders to the excavation, the conservation, the interpretation, and appropriation of their own patrimony. Yet, a closer look, and these are two bibliographical references I'm using in this part. A closer look at the ways modern Egypt came to term with its pharaonic past shows that this, too, required an intricate play of cultural and political strategies with reference to the past and its grasp on the present. Contrary to many other Mediterranean nations, notably the Greeks and the Italians, the Egyptians did not initially wish to base their national identity on an antique heritage. In fact, what made them a nation was the difference from ancient Egypt. They identified ethnically as Arabs and religiously as Muslims. Hence, they counted their national history from the moment pre-Arab Egypt had ceased to exist. Soon, however, that is already by the end of the 19th century, Egyptian intellectuals and politicians realized that their nation's fate was inexorably related to those phantasmic forefathers whom they were so reluctant to recognize as their own. And this simply because perceptions of Egypt tended to glorify pharaonic antiquity and its majestic remains, while at the same time bemoaned the fact that the glory that was Egypt was now in the hands of uncultured infidels who deserved to be replaced by more competent administrators. Following, therefore, a course already taken in Greece, or more or less at the same time, as well as in other Mediterranean nations such as Italy and Spain, a new generation of Egyptian intellectuals started to imagine pharaonic Egypt as a shared experience of place, rather than a distinct period in history that had no affinity to modern Egyptians. By the interwar years of the 20th century, Egyptian nationalism had learned to appreciate its imagined continuity between a glorified ancient past and a thoroughly modernized present, thus creating a nation state that was less Arabic or Islamic and more Egyptian, or indeed modern. This gave rise to Pharaonism, a discourse promoted in Egypt by secularist and historically by secularist national elites of the 1930s, whereby ancient and modern Egypt were described as politically and historically identical, as the one was imagined as the continuation and culmination of the other. As the case of Greece had already shown, however, if Egyptian modernity was to be understood as a justification of pharaonic antiquity, modern Egyptians had to be in charge of Egyptology and the pharaonic antiquities it produced. To paraphrase Michael Billig, talking about language, it is not archaeology that generates nationalism so much as nationalism that is in need of archaeology. So for the remainder of this section, I will examine how pharaonic materialities have been deployed as political instruments within Egypt in an attempt to show how archaeopolitical uses of archaeology may be also used as emancipatory tools in modernity. To do this, I will turn to the example of the Egyptian mummy as an example of embodied cognition of the past through its latent materialities, as well as the ways that in modernity, bodies become archaeopolitical tools in themselves. The Egyptian mummy, according to Foucault, the utopia of the body negated and transfigured, is an illuminating example of this discourse. Perceived for centuries as a marketable commodity, it was redeployed as a political tool by Western colonists and Egyptian nationalists alike in the framework of the Pharaonism movement already mentioned. Mummies and their rehumanization were integral to the systematic effort of Egyptian elites to lay cultural claims to ancient Egypt as the cradle and unifying force of modern Egyptian nationalism. Beginning in the 19th century, state sovereignty and national identity in Egypt were pretty much fashioned on the ways the nation came to terms with its heritage in order to safeguard, manage, and promote it. And antiquities, often alongside the custodians, were elevated to the status of national heroes. This relationship is thoroughly explored in Egyptian literature and other media. Here, however, I choose to dwell on what has often been hailed as the most important film of Egyptian cinema. I suppose many in the audience would know it, Shadi Abdel Salam's The Day of Counting the Years, also known as Al-Mamia, The Mummy. The film was shot in 1969, but only released in 1975. Set in 1881, on the eve of British colonial rule, the film is based on the true story of the Abdal Rasuls, an Upper Egyptian clan that had been robbing a hoard of mummies discovered at a tomb near the village of Karna and selling the artifacts found inside the tombs on the illicit antiquities market. After the death of his father, one of the tribe's elders, young Wanis, finds himself estranged from his clan, the backward-looking, ignorant, superstitious, and violent Harbats, as the tribe is renamed in the film, and eventually decides to collaborate with the state authorities, who then ransack the village and rescue the mummies by taking them to the National Museum in Cairo. Through a visual vocabulary in many respects evoking European art house cinema, long, often real-time takes, dreamy pacing, long silences, lingering close-ups, Shadi Abdel Salam has tried, in his own words, to recount Egypt's authentic history, a tale of two Egypts, in fact, the modern, urban, nationalist Egypt of Cairo in the north, eventually leading the war against colonial rule, and the uneducated, vulgar peasantry, unpatriotically complacent in its stagnant petty life in the provinces in the south. The film's ambivalence lies not in its script. This is straightforwardly a story of the efforts made by the national administration to safeguard its patrimony in order to restore its ties with the eternal spirit of Egypt, but in its aesthetics, as its main focus is the young peasant who discovers his true identity in the artifacts he is supposed to desecrate. The night of counting the years of the title is, according to the Book of the Dead, the moment when the deceased name is returned to memory so that his nameless soul may stop wandering in endless toil. The viewer gets the feeling that, according to the director, the peasant culture of Upper Egypt is the true national culture of Egypt, is Egypt's authentic history. The physical bond with the antiquities displayed by the film's peasantry, the drama of its protagonist's decision to place himself under the rule of the Cairo elite, the odd use of classical Arabic throughout the film betrays its director's fear that cultural authenticity might not lie with the self-appointed champions after all. In his film, therefore, Abdel Salam explores Egyptian archaeopolitics in a multi-leveled as well as indecisive way. In Al-Mamia, we're able to witness two opposing breeds of archaeopolitics at war, as perceived by a late 20th century nationalist intellectual. In the beginning of the film, when young Wanis is introduced to his tribe's secrete trove of mummies after his father's funeral, we are exposed to what we, as Westerners of the modern era, would perceive as an act of sacrilege. A valuable necklace in the form of a sizable eye of Horus, you can see that in the screen, is forcibly taken off one of the mummies lying in their final resting place. And only after one of the tribe's elders severs the mummy's head with his axe, itself a symbol of the battle of good against evil, fought between gods Horus and Set. the wedged eye was apparently gouged off from Horus by his mortal enemy, only to be restored to him with the help of another divinity, Thoth. This show of cruel irreverence to the dead and on the day of his father's own funeral shakes the young protagonist, who is seen running through the rocky terrain in doubt and despair. When later Vanessa's brother complains to the elders about such unseemly treatment of the dead, he is told that what he calls the dead is only dust and wood from thousands of years ago, whose name and family line is now long forgotten. In contrast with the view of the tribe's leaders, the movie makes clear that for the Central Egyptian state of the time, what Vanessa's brother calls the dead are part of a complicated narrative through which to impose itself upon its own people. As archaeological artifacts, on the one hand, mummies must be re-individualized and re-sacralized, scientifically excavated, conserved, studied, and eventually displayed in a metropolitan museum such as the one at Cairo for all to see. And on the other, they are deployed as discursive figures in an effort to unify as well as historicize the nation, both within itself and against its foreign antagonists. For as the movie was clearly scripted within the climate of Nasserite nationalism of the 1950s and the 1960s, it's interesting to have Ahmad Kamal as one of its protagonists, the native Egyptian archaeologist who managed eventually, alongside very few others, to establish Egyptology as a discipline locally taught and practiced in Egypt against the severely discriminatory practices of the foreign archaeological schools who practically dominated the field until the 1920s. The way Al-Mamia represents archaeology, therefore, is strikingly political. Wanis's torment between his tribe's well-being and his country's modernization suggests that, as Abdul Salam himself does, he, Wanis, fears that his people have been estranged from their authentic identity. At the same time, however, as Wanis comes to realize towards the end of the film, the westernized Cairene state with which his loyalties ought to lie in its effort to counter foreign oppression through an emphasis, among other things, on the practice of national archaeology, runs the risk of betraying its own tradition-bound, backward-looking peasantry. Wanis performs his own archaeology in the film in very much an embodied way. He's often been seen pacing, resting, running, or sleeping among the ruins, and his lingering shots provide the film with its contemplative distance aesthetics that seem so detached, both from Western shot, reverse shot montage, as well as Egyptian popular melodrama. When the film's two protagonists, the young tribesman and the Cairene archaeologist, finally meet, they face one another in a long silence before the latter comment about Wanis that he resembles a statue that has woken up. Archaeology in Egypt, in this respect, and very much like its European or Asian counterparts, becomes a biopolitical template that works both as the nation's territorial chart as well as a blueprint by means of which to construct and organize its own citizens as archaeo-bodies, in fact. Following a break imposed by the Arab Spring revolt and the renegotiation of the country's pharaonic heritage between the proponents of secularism on the one hand and the Islamists on the other, Egypt seems once again keen to promote pharaonism as one of its constitutive identity traits, if only to regain the acceptance of the West. As the country's popularity with tourists and the cruise industry has suffered dramatically since the 2011 uprisings, this new effort seems to be aiming at making Egypt once again attractive for the international tourist crowds. A series of new museums have been planned in this framework, including a new archaeological museum to replace the one in Cairo, dubbed the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. The new institution manages once again to nationalize the pharaonic legacy, as well as the Western-born discipline of Egyptology. On April 3rd, 2021, this year, you probably couldn't miss it, a spectacular event took place, organized as a televised show under the somewhat flashy title, Pharaoh's Golden Parade. The aim of the procession was to transfer 22 mummies from the Old Cairo Museum to their new home. Rather than simply moving the remains, however, as one would do with any other sort of artifact, the Egyptian state decided to go all out, organizing a royal fanfare whereby the mummies were paraded through the streets of Cairo inside individually crafted, custom-made carriages decorated with pharaonic insignia, as if the 22 royals were still alive and well and still ruling the realm. The show, which was attended by Egypt's head of state and the country's top officials, was accompanied by an extravagant Egyptiana show, complete with pharaoh-like costume dances, live singing, and posturing all'antica, involving the country's major archaeological sites. In many respects, recalling other such shows discussed in the previous sections, the Pharaoh's Golden Parade seemed already out-parodied by Steve Martin's King Tut number from the 1970s, commenting, as if in anticipation of the parade's extravaganza, that Egypt's pharaohs gave their life for tourism. Broadcast as a cross between a Eurovision Song Contest interval act and the Super Bowl halftime show like the one from 2012 with Madonna dazzling the crowds in a Cleopatra-like outfit, the Golden Parade was supposed to bring to mind, at best, Hollywood's Land of the Pharaohs, filmed by Howard Hawks in 1955, came, however, perilously close to a Las Vegas matinee. With the Golden Parade, Egypt thus reconfirmed its commitment to a thoroughly westernized modernity, like Greece had repeatedly done, for example, with the 2004 Athens Olympics opening ceremony, when Greek culture was equated to classical art and national continuity was paraded as a seamless aesthetic experience in a display not very different from the New York parade discussed in the beginning of my talk. Yet, both examples confirm that archaeopolitics as a nationalist project of sorts is conceived within the confines of modernity itself. By committing the bodies of the citizens to archaeological performances, the two nation-states confirmed the exclusionary nature of heritage. By prioritizing antiquity over the present, such archaeological regimes, on the one hand, declare their independence against any crypto-colonial powers out there, and on the other, organize their citizenry along the lines of their access to a cultural heritage that is imagined at once as both superior and exclusive. So that was the end of part one. Let me just refresh myself for a bit. And we move to part two, kitsch-nation. In the previous section, I explored some aspects of the perennial tension between culture's owners and its claimants. Time and again, conflicts over identity, cultural appropriation, or even colonization develop into shrewd politics of ownership, inclusivity, and segregationism. Who owns culture is a moot point, really. A rhetorical question ostensibly leading to an equally rhetorical, acquiescent everyone, while in fact insinuating that culture truly belongs to those asking the question in the first place. Diffusing particular claims to heritage ends up privileging those with privileged access to it from the very beginning. Under this light, the Egyptians' effort to claim pharaonism for themselves, like the Greeks with Hellenism, seems futile. The more you claim, the more you accept the centrality of the world's First Nations in global heritage management, or at least the leading role of the West Metropolitan Museums in it. And we're just talking about the Louvre exhibit over tea. As a generation, at least, of post-colonial scholarship has shown us, the notional phantoms we like to refer as Europe, the West, whatever, remain the subject of all histories, indeed of history as a singular destiny for all humanity. I'm using here Dipesh Chakrabarty's critique. As a result, to claim cultural independence is to fight for something already imagined, dreamed of, and desired by a Western collective mind, which tends to be predominantly male and by definition white and privileged. For before Greek Hellenism came European classicism, and long before 20th century Egyptian pharaonism, the West lived in the fever of l'Egyptiomanie. In an established world order, therefore, where the past is systematically deployed as a representation of the present, peripheral modernities feel the need to revert to mythical pasts, albeit ones first imagined by others, in order to challenge what Michael Hetzfeld has called the established world order politics of significance. To do this, they have to revert to primeval and wildly imagined pasts, which they claim for their own at the risk of being criticized of an acutely anachronistic nostalgia. Theorized as subordinate cultures in the peripheries of modernity, cultural entities such as Egypt, Greece, India, or Japan even reinvent themselves through a typically self-orientalizing discourse in order to claim new kinds of centrality in the contemporary world system. Cultural heritage, the past in its various reincarnations, revived through historical events and archaeological artifacts, is enlisted in this effort as an index of historical and cultural particularism, as a fearsome weapon against the enemy, be they the West or globalization or both, even if such enemies are invented, forged, and reinvented by the same means as those employed by their opponents. The past is re-politicized with a vengeance. In the last 20 years or so, such strategies have been studied under the light of an effort to recenter globalization, as this process has been called by Koichi Iwabuchi, studying Japanese popular culture, or provincialize Europe and the West at large, as discussed by Chakrabarty. To the schemes outlined above, I would add my own feeling that such appropriation and counter-appropriation strategies, in fact, constitute projects through which to negotiate and renegotiate whiteness. The concept of a generalized white identity is a rather recent one, as a racial discourse in the term used by Zeus Leonardo. Whiteness is designed and continuously redeployed as a tool by means of which to generate and uphold systemic racism. Chronically associated with the political and cultural elites of the West, classical studies, including the appreciation and study of Greek and Roman art, have ended up becoming emblematic of white privilege worldwide. As a result, while post-colonial struggles across the globe have often placed classical learning in a rather awkward position as a symbol of imperialism and colonization, at the same time, it may be deployed as a weapon of emancipation, or a means by which the colonized may reclaim their own whiteness. As it has long been argued, certain ethnic groups, the most telling example among which being the Irish Americans, had in the 19th or 20th century to reclaim the racial identity as white against an entire set of racist stereotypes perceiving them as culturally inferior and civilized, and though certainly not black, not quite white either. For the Greek emigrants into the United States, the situation must have been similar, if not worse. Coming from a country in the periphery of Europe, and one still forming part of the Ottoman Empire until the mid-19th century, if not later, parts of Greece were liberated in the early 20th century, Greeks found it difficult to pass as white in their new home unless they claimed their cultural and racial affiliations with Hellenism. So, whereas the Irish, for example, reclaimed their whiteness based on their Catholic ties and work ethics, the Greeks, like those in the photograph from the 4th of July parade discussed above, had to negotiate their whiteness on the strength of their classical heritage. The effort from the point of view of the margins to emerge as authentic and metropolitan, ironic and futile as it may seem, has been theorized as colonial mimicry by Homi Bhabha and others, or as crypto-coloniality by Michael Hertzfeld in the case of Greece and other nation states that appear to fight colonialism without having ever been colonized as such. Seen at a glance, both these approaches seem to marginalize the margins even further, taking the subaltern status of subalternity as a historical and cultural given. They seem to cast the non-West to the role of perpetual consumer of modernity through readings that are themselves essentialist, elitist, Eurocentric, and coming from a privileged, bourgeois, academic high ground. I mean, who am I to be talking about privilege? I still see, however, merit in these attempts as a genuine effort to counter the Western-fed notions of a unified as well as unavoidable political modernity disguised as history, supported and expressed by singular metropolitan culture, efforts to mimic, appropriate, or invent Western culture as a means to promote local past against global histories must be seen as efforts to locate one's speech outside European logocentrism, even if such efforts backfire more often than not. Even if that is, we tend to laugh at a toga parade in New York of the 1910s, or at Japanese karaoke, Bollywood, and Chinese pop, or Greek pop for that matter. We do so because we fear that our modernity might become reconfigured and in effect decentralized by such attempts at a globalized Westernness. Archaeopolitics is devised in order to enforce this template of and against cultural authority. In other words, to imprint logocentric Western intellectual strategies of empiricism, idealism, and monoculturalism on any peripheral modernities out there. Thinking about political modernity, Dibesh Chakrabarty was arguing in the beginning of the 21st century, inevitably entails invoking concepts and notional classifications driving their deep genealogies from the intellectual and even theological traditions of Western Europe, hence trying to constitute a peripheral modernity outside the margins of Eurocentrism. And this, I should add, explains the unsettling, undermining, and in effect, emancipatory role of parody or a carnivalesque performance of metropolitan traditions away from the vital space. In order to explain this, I would like to revisit one of my favorite examples, a rather recent archaeopolitical performance that very much looks like the regurgitation of the New York parade I presented at the beginning of my paper. On a Saturday afternoon in June 2015, 7 Greek women dressed in what seemed to be classical Hellenic attire crossed the streets of London and entered a rather unsuspecting British museum. 6 of them were dressed in white and made up so as to look like marble statues coming alive, whereas the 7th, acting as the leader, was wearing a different, though still antique-like garment and was crowned with a wreath. Upon entering the museum galleries, and after staged search for one of the statues on display, the squad of revived statues hosted a ritual of sorts involving some supposedly meaningful steps, gestures, and gazes. The statue in question was, you guessed it, Greece's lost daughter, one of the 6 by now world-famous Caryatids that once adorned the Erechtheion, and Ionic Athenian temple of the later 5th century BCE. Taken by Lord Elgin to England in the beginning of the 19th century, alongside most of what was considered worthwhile among the sculptural embellishments of the Parthenon and other buildings nearby. The Marble Maiden has emerged in Greek popular imagination as an abducted sister, a Greek soul imprisoned in rainy London, away from the life-giving, heartwarming Athenian sun. At the same time, the type was freely adopted by European classicism as an architectural staple, chiefly in order to decorate buildings associated with the regime, from palaces and houses of parliament to courthouses, schools, and banks. Since both the type and its symbolic baggage, therefore, also form part of a strategy on behalf of Western elites to legitimize their claims on classical heritage, modern Greek appropriations of it may be seen to derive from a need to decolonize that heritage in order to proclaim it exclusively Greek. The comparison between the New York parade and the from the early 20th century discussed above and the London parade a century later confirms that certain gestures of embodying the antique have become stereotypical in the way contemporary Greeks choose to represent themselves in relation to a classical past they defiantly describe as their own. Now, in recent years, there have been many plays, many modern Greek plays about the sixth caryatid. I've discussed a few of those in a recent paper. However, now, today, I'm going to talk about another genre of this type, children's books. I'm going to discuss two sort of fairy tales written by contemporary Greeks, published both in Greek and English and perhaps other languages, and readily available in Greece. Actually, both these copies were purchased at the New Acropolis Museum bookstore. First one is Nights Without Carrie, published in 2015, written by Australian-born Nikki Dollis, who actually, according to her own blurb in the book, holds a key role in management at the museum. The book is subtitled as a story about the sixth caryatid. And the story imagines all female statues of the museum that love being admired and talked about, waking every night after closing time to play amongst themselves. So you have the chori, the caryatids, whatever. Oddly enough, in the story, the archaic chori appear as nieces to the five stately, spectacularly beautiful sisters, that is, the remaining caryatids, whom in art historical terms, they predate by a century or so. As the young chori approach their aunties, the latter are seen having removed the column capitals resting on their heads as bonnets and chatting among themselves with their wonderful thick braids falling down their backs. Then they repeat the tale of the day when a whole band of Chori statues was discovered and revealed to the modern world for the very first time. Inevitably, discussion turns to poor Carrie, taken to London, since in those years it was common for powerful countries to do exactly as they pleased. Painting modernity as an unjust place where no restrictions applied to such barbaric actions, the book seems anxious to counter British claims on the Elgin collection, thus turning its narrative into a text of not so subtle propaganda. In doing that, its author recycles and enriches the idea that the caryatids, as well as other statues of humans from the Acropolis, are actual people, something like nieces or cousins to the book's modern Greek readers. Hence, in both these storybooks, the protagonists are statues of humans rather than of deities. And as the book makes clear, these ties are exclusive to Greeks who do not apply to the rest of the modern world, which simply needs to face the fact of Greece's special relationship with its own classical antiquity. Interestingly enough, the story excludes male statues, both, one assumes, in order to avoid the awkwardness of youths running around the museum galleries in the nude, but mostly because the author wants to construct a matrilinear poetics for the Greek nation, with those marble girls being portrayed as the nation's distant mothers, aunties, and sisters. The case for blood ties between the statues, the Greek soil, and, through the latter, the Greek people, is further promoted in the storybook Adventures of the Acropolis Marbled Girls, published in 2012 by Eleni Hadjoudi-Tunta. The story centers on Zisis Sotiriou, a historical figure who worked as custodian of the Acropolis in the late 19th century and was among the first to protest against the wrong thing, the injustice, and the evil deed of the abduction of his daughter, as he calls the missing caryatid. The book dwells on the replica used to replace the missing statue, an intruder resented by the remaining original caryatids because she, the new one, the replacement, did not know the language and had not pentelic blood in her veins, turning white marble from penteli, that is the statue's material of make, into a bodily fluid that sustains life and at the same time defines genetic structure and family ties. The book seemingly innocuous simile constructs the ancient statues as living organisms endowed with a singularity of the soil out of which they emerged. As pentelic marble is indigenous to Athens, so are the statues' cultural, in fact, quasi-biological ties to the modern Greeks exclusive and inseverable. As the abducted caryatid is said to be missing Greece's golden sun and beautiful sky, Greek cultural identity is reconfirmed as a natural bond between modern humans and ancient artifacts, material things, which, however, are imbued with vibrant life. In the Greek original, Hadjoudi-Tunta's book is titled Caryatids Counting the Moons, a further metaphysical aspect of the story, uniting the revived classical statues with the book's protagonist, a fustanella-clad veteran of the Greek War of Independence, through the mediation of the country's Byzantine tradition, complete with angels and saints. The performances and texts I have discussed so far fall within the patterns of colonial mimicry and crypto-coloniality, a collective cultural expression fueled by the desire to emerge as authentic, as Homi Bhabha put it, through a process of writing and repetition, thus leading to the final irony of partial representation. And it is in this context of partial representation and irony that I'm discussing the performance of the 7 women at the British Museum a few years back, but also I would like to revisit a couple of houses, a recent trend in Greek architecture, whereby you find this sort of buildings emerging in some parts of Athens, but also in places away from Athens. This is in the island of Euboea. Now, these houses I call the Egaleo houses because most of them are in an Athenian neighborhood of Egaleo, show this sort of aggressive archaeolatry, which seems to be trivializing classicism to such an extent as to produce a kitsch version of it, or rather what to many residents or visitors to Greece must be familiar as neo-Hellenic meta-kitsch. So whereas overdone kitsch imagery is supposed to trigger a reflexive emotional reaction to its viewers, the highly charged classicism proposed by these houses, like the fondly archaeological imagery encountered in any Greek souvenir shop, as well as I would argue any of the images or performances I discussed today, overdo the admiration for the cultural tradition they ostensibly serve to such an extent as to end up rivaling it. Far from merely an abusive term suggesting poor taste or low culture, kitsch has been shown to constitute an eclectic aesthetic, thus undermining the long-standing and utterly unproductive binaries of good, bad art, or high, low culture. So I'm not talking along these lines. I don't consider these to be neither good or bad, neither beautiful or ugly. Kitsch, in other words, both as an analytical template and a validatory discourse over aesthetic choice, is expected to maintain the role of high art as a discriminatory tool and confirm taste as a privilege of the few. Meta-kitsch is born at the point where even the very critique of kitsch as repetitive, comforting garbage becomes trivialized, and critics like ourselves appear redundant in themselves. Negotiating the past, or rather the semantics of the past through the politics of archaeology, as a result, delegates peripheral nation states like Greece to becoming kitsch nations. That is, realms of partial representation, where world hierarchies of cultural meaning appear violated. In other words, a kitsch nation is an archaeopolitical institution in the periphery of the West that recenters globalization, provincializes Western taste, and successfully decolonizes the past by undermining the established global flow of taste, cultural significance, and social distinction. At the same time, however, through the mobilization of archaeophilia, nationalism, racism, and the body, kitsch nations may be easily turned into thanatopolitical regimes through the exclusion of any living body in the realm that does not abide with this kind of templates. That is, states with a love of things ancient may be used to legitimize intolerance, xenophobia, and eventually the death of anybody that does not fit the archaeopolitical discourse. But this is a different discussion altogether, and perhaps we can